The Rishonim, the Rif, and the Rush point out that one should not interrupt from the time of Baruch She'amar through the end of Tefillah. And the reasoning the Kolbo writes is because Psuki de Zimra was enacted as a means of preparation for Tefillah. We are giving Shevach, we are praising Hashem, and we're meant to go straight from that into Tefillah, so it would be highly inappropriate to interrupt. The Beis Yosef, based off the Yerushalmi, says also that it's a grave sin for one to interrupt between Yishtabach and Yotzer, that if one cannot interrupt from Baruch Shamar through the end of Tefillah, all the more so one should not interrupt between Yishtabach and Yotzer. Other than, he writes, for a case of a mitzvah. If there is a necessity of a mitzvah, for example, he says if someone's collecting tzedakah, then one could interrupt after Yishtabach prior to the beginning Shachris. But short of such a need of a mitzvah, it would be strictly prohibited. And the way the Beis Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch write it is that it would in fact be a ve'er hibiyot, would be a grave transgression to interrupt at such a moment. However, this comes up now. This came up at the beginning of the pandemic in terms of when we had to minimize what we would daven in shul. We couldn't recite Psuki de Zimra in shul, so we discussed whether one should come at Yishtabach or conclude. We recommended that one come after Yishtabach because of hefsek between the brachos of Baruch Shamar and Yishtabach. However, without such a need, it still is prohibited to interrupt from after Yishtabach and prior to Shachris. Why does this come up again now? Because there was a minhag of the Arizal who introduced that during the time of the Yom Noraim, through the Aseret Tshuva, to institute the paragraph of Shir Hama'alot of Tehillim immediately after Yishtabach, prior to saying Kaddish and Baruch Hu. And that was the minhag of the Arizal and many Sfardim. However, it seemed to have not always been the practice of Ashkenazim, but it has in recent times seemed to make way into the Ashkenazic literature as well. And the Magen Avraham points out that there is this practice that some have after reciting Yishtabach to go ahead and say Shir Hama'alot, and he says that this seems to be against the halacha written in Shulchan Aruch, and Mishnah Berurah quotes that as well, which seems to indicate his consent on the stance of the Magen Avraham. In fact, Rav Shechter says very clearly that the minhag Ashkenaz is not to include that in. The Ateres Zekanim quotes from Maharshal, though, that it makes sense to include it. Why? Because he says the problem in interrupting between Yishtabach and Yotzer is when it's a problem of divrei batala, of just speaking, that we shouldn't just entirely interrupt. However, if there's a purpose, or if you're saying Tehillim, which is Shevach of Hashem, certainly that would be allowed. And that seems to be a lot of the basis and understanding of why even many Ashkenazi places maintain the practice until today on the Yom Noraim through the Aseret Tshuva to still recite the paragraph of Shir Hama'alot. In fact, that is our practice here at Kins, that we do recite the Shir Hama'alot. Perhaps that's where the Nusach Sfard has maintained. But even many, many pure Ashkenazi places, even if they weren't merger of Nusach Sfard shuls, do maintain this practice, and everyone, of course, should follow the practice of their place. Have a fantastic day.